I would like to ask now the next speaker, Mr. Nejc Urankar, which will present us the topic. Are you watching closely? The many faces of censorship in the digital age. The floor is yours, sir.
Okay. Okay, I hope you can see the PowerPoint as it is. Okay,
Yes.
Once again, thank you for having me. I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak about what is not only always a hot topic, but also a very important one. My name is Nejc Urankar. I'm researcher at Faculty of Law in Ljubljana, and my general research focus lies in the intersection of freedom of expression and social inequality. As I'm analyzing the boundaries of this freedom through the inequality lens. So in this regard, one might expect that I'm sitting here today having this speech to defend censorship, or if we will argue that content moderation as we know it is indeed not going far enough, but that is not the case. In my presentation, I will make, hopefully, convincingly enough, the case that the censorship is indeed a problem. It is a threat, actually a big one. And of course, provided at the same time that we understand it in this popular term that only involves its negative implications, the negative connotation. However, I do make a very important remark at this point, and I argue that our common understanding of the problem to which in a general discourse, in very simplified terms, as I said, we refer to as censorship, may not be entirely adapted to the challenges that came with the 21st century and digital era. So what we need to understand at the very beginning is that the problems of free expression and censorship in any era are shaped by the communications technology available for people to use and by the ways that people actually at the same time use that technology. So I'm making the case for the claim that neither censorship nor freedom of expression during the digital era operate under the same logic as it did under the printed media and the broadcast television or the street corner speakers era. So since in the past decades, some cornerstones have been undeniably shaken, and it's really hard not to deny that. The understanding of the threats that censorship imposed on our society may also found itself in the place where certain redefinitions are required. And while a lot of scholar attention has been drawn to the concept of censorship lately, I make a claim that we must turn our attention from the direct state censorship to some other speech control techniques that extensively shape the public discourse of today and of tomorrow. Before I do that, I turn to the seemingly easy question, what censorship is. It's definitely not entirely a legal term, and it allows us to be a little creative here. However, every legal doctrine focused on the protection of the expression is also a legal doctrine of free expression regulation, and or we could easily say also a doctrine of censorship. This is the reason why the censorship would often be defined as the exact opposite of free expression. And since we want to explore the definition of censorship, the law could offer us a strong point to begin with. According to European Convention of Human Rights, freedom of expression is the right that belongs to everyone and shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. And if we now ask ourselves again what censorship is, we would have to turn this upside down. Put in a very simple terms, we may perhaps define censorship as an interference by public authority, or with a somehow more precise definition, official control over the flow of information and ideas. And if I now move to another remark that I would like to make here, which is of significant importance for what follows, is the recognition that the fact that freedom of expression deeply concerns power. It concerns questions of how to constrain power, how to balance power, how to hold it accountable. For example, when we take a look at the very beginnings of the development of free expression principle, which was more than a century ago, or even more. We have powerful state on one hand, and what could be said to be the powerless dissenters on the other. And we know that censorship, most often in the form of criminal liability, had been weaponized by the powerful state to shut down some of the unfavorable, unpopular, yet legitimate ideas on the other. When the law eventually armed these marginalized dissenters with the freedom of expression protection, the ones whose ideas were until then not favored and often not heard could finally speak up and use their voices to expose the oppression, for example. And without any doubt, as with traditional conceptions of power in the physical world, power in the digital world must also be regulated in some form. And it all comes to the question of our imagination, what power is and where it comes from. And while the viewpoints here may differ significantly, it is quite clear that the digital world has given way to some new power structures and added some distortions to the so-called marketplace of ideas that in the past have not been there, have not been present. So the main assumptions that the law of freedom of expression, and also the understanding of censorship grew up with are as follows. The first is that the state is assumed to be the main threat to free expression. The classic conception goes that power of the evil state threatens the individual's right to speak. Moving to the second is the premise that the supply of public information and ideas is only very limited. For years, it was taken for granted that only few people would be able to share their thoughts or ideas on important topics in a meaningful way that the others would be prepared to listen. And the last third notable assumption arises from the second. The attention of the audience or listeners was assumed to be relatively easily to obtain. And it is almost obsolete to pose a rhetorical question. Do these assumptions still hold true in the digital age? Can we really still confidently say that state is a primary censor? Could anyone argue that the supply of information is limited in the internet world as it was a century ago? Isn't exactly the struggle for attention what defines the online world of today? And rhetorical questions in general do not require an answer, so I will not take a lot of time here. Perhaps I can just take a moment to look into how the attention industry, as Tim Wu calls the social media businesses, has risen. We can see this extreme flood of information in the online environment that came with the popularization of internet and massive decrease in the costs of being online speaker. So being an online speaker really became cheap. The cheap speech really flooded the online environment. And unlike a century ago, speaking is easy, but if it was once hard to speak, it is now hard to be heard. The amount of attention that certain information and ideas will get has reduced significantly. At the same time, as seen from the same data. Listener attention is therefore highly fought for and subject to intense competition. And this all combined has definitely had several important implications. First of all, it gives the main social media or speech platforms, which do not consider themselves to be a part of the press, an extremely important role in the construction of public discourse and also in the construction of reality. They're able to control or moderate the flow of information and publicly presented ideas, and do so significantly. And if we return back to our initial definition of censorship, we might find out that these private interferences that come with so-called counter-moderation are not that different from the interferences of the public authorities. If anything, their effects are by far bigger. Therefore, some internet law scholars, like before mentioned Tim Wu and also Jack Balkin, for example, argue that it is not a direct punishment by the state, which is the relevant means of censorship, or at least it's a threat. And that the state itself, it's not the primary censor anymore. It comes as a no surprise that these activities are today commonly labeled as private censorship. And another important consequence of this development in the digital age is the emergence of potential of some new or less sophisticated speech control techniques that have significant potential in affecting the flow of information and ideas and are therefore widely used in the digital world of today and, as I said, of tomorrow. Direct censorship, despite its historic effectiveness, has fallen out of favor in this new media environment. Of course, it remains a major issue and it has to be dealt with carefully. However, it is far less attractive, sometimes even counterproductive, given the proliferation of cheaper and often more effective alternatives. So I'm going to ask in the end myself, what are these other speech control techniques that with some creativity, considering the same factual effects as the traditional censorship was aimed at, could be also considered censorship in this broader sense. And Tim Wu here suggests three categories of those alternatives. First is online harassment and attacks. This includes speech control approach using especially troll armies and organized attacks on the speaker that often has a fatal chilling effect on the speakers, especially when they belong to some marginalized, powerful group. If we ask ourselves how to silence the speech of the powerless, Ray Langton here suggested that one way might be to stop the powerless from speaking at all. For example, gag them or threaten them, perhaps. But there's another less dramatic, but actually equally effective way. We can let them speak, but let them speak whatever they like to whomever they like, but stop that speech from counting, stop it from being what it was intended to be. And that's exactly what online harassment and attacks do. They either stop someone from speaking at all, or take away the message that it was intended to have. And of course, this is in large extent exactly what the direct censorship was about a century ago. The other second speech control technique here could be distorting and flooding, or so-called reverse censorship. Reverse censorship actually does pretty much the same as I just thought. It lets people speak, but by taking the attention from them, the message is not heard. It often relies on so-called astroturfing or propaganda robots and counter-programming with a sufficient volume of information, often meaningless, to drown out the disfavored speech, or at least distort the information environment. And of course, this could in fact be just as effective speech control technique as more traditional forms of censorship. And finally, control of the main speech platforms. This has also received extensive scholar attention. For example, Volkin speaks about old school and new school regulation. And as a part of the problem of private governance of speech, he argues that understanding the developments that came with the changes in the infrastructure of free expression, states have developed new techniques for speech regulation. In addition to targeting speakers directly, they now target the owners of private infrastructure, hoping to coerce or co-opt them into regulating speech on the nation state's behalf. In a way, they would like to do so with a direct censorship, but this is far more efficient, they do it like indirectly. So using private censorship as an indirect means to the state censorship. And just to wrap it up here and conclude, I believe that if we want to address the problem properly, all of these new techniques should be explored extensively and put under scrutiny. What I argue is that while legal research is often being focused on one part, which is of course the most obvious one, we are missing something else, something perhaps bigger and more important that in its effect leads to the same effect as the direct, more traditional censorship does. And are you watching closely is the catchphrase in the Christopher Nolan's movie, The Prestige. Magician uses that phrase to misdirect the audience attention. And the whole point of magic trick is to deceive. And I'm concerned that when it comes to the discourse about freedom of expression and especially censorship, our attention is misdirected by the free speech narrative that uses this strong word censorship with a fixed negative connotation, but at the same time often implies only the direct censorship and perhaps sometimes even the private censorship. But only rarely it implies other forms of equally problematic content control mechanisms, such as I said, as I said, distorting and flooding, so-called reverse censorship, and online harassment in a text with chilling effect as its effect. And of course, just for that reason, I must say I'm really happy that this is a topic of this conference, and of course I'm glad we're moving in the right direction. So yeah, I'm gonna finish here and just thank you for your attention.